My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 29 years old, and last Christmas Eve, my own mother called me poor right in front of the entire family. My dad sneered and said I was wasting my life. My cousin Derek laughed and offered me charity in the form of a $60,000 entry-level job, and for one horrible moment I actually wondered if they were right. Maybe I was the failure they all thought I was. Maybe my choices had been completely wrong. But then my father's eyes locked onto something on my wrist, his voice started shaking, and he whispered words that would change everything. You see, what my family didn't know was that I'd been keeping the biggest secret of my life, and it was about to explode in ways none of us could have imagined. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who are supposed to love you most, if you've ever sat at a family dinner feeling like the outsider, or if you've ever wondered whether quiet success is more powerful than loud and wealth, then you need to hear what happened that Christmas night when a $3 million watch turned my family's world completely upside down. Let me take you back to where it began. I never thought I'd be standing at a funeral in November, staring down at a $3 million watch on my wrist and feeling like the poorest person in the room. Not because of money, but because David Chen, the man who taught me everything about real success, was gone. The memorial service at Trinity Church in Boston was packed with tech billionaires, venture capitalists, and Fortune 500 CEOs. Everyone wanted to pay their respects to the legend who'd built 4 unicorn companies and revolutionized how we think about artificial intelligence. But I wasn't there as some industry insider. I was there as the girl he'd taken under his wing 5 years ago, when I was nobody special and he was already everything. I touched the watch, gently remembering how he'd pressed it into my hands just 2 weeks earlier in his hospital room at Massachusetts General. His voice had been weak, but his eyes still held that spark of mischief I'd come to love. This piece traveled with me through 4 companies, 2 market crashes, 1 very public failure. Now it belongs with you. I'd protested, of course. David, I can't accept this. It's too much. He'd smiled that knowing smile of his. Sarah, you still don't understand, do you? The value isn't in the metal or the mechanism, it's in what it represents. Now, surrounded by all these powerful people who were sharing their David Chen success stories, I finally understood what he meant. This wasn't just a timepiece, it was a legacy. My mind drifted back to that first day I met him in March 2019. I was 24, fresh out of Harvard Business School with my MBA, and absolutely convinced I knew everything about entrepreneurship. I'd landed a product manager position at TechFlow, a struggling Boston startup that was burning through cash faster than a Formula One car burns rubber. David had been brought in as an advisor during our most desperate quarter. We were 3 weeks away from shutting down when he walked into our cramped Cambridge office space. I remember thinking he looked nothing like the tech mogul I'd expected. No expensive suit, no flashy watch, no entourage. Just a 62-year-old man in a simple cashmere sweater and khakis carrying a worn leather messenger bag. He drove a 2015 Toyota Camry, a Camry. I'd seen the Forbes articles about his net worth somewhere north of $2 billion, and this man was driving a car my college roommate would have been embarrassed to own. But when he started speaking in that first strategy meeting, everyone in the room fell silent. David had this way of cutting through all the noise and getting straight to the heart of what mattered. While the rest of us were obsessing over features and functionality, he asked one simple question that changed everything. Who are you really trying to help, and why should they care? That question saved TechFlow. More importantly, it saved me from becoming just another MBA who confused activity with achievement. Over the next 8 months, as David helped us restructure and refocus, he became my mentor in ways I never expected. He'd show up with Chinese takeout from this little place in Chinatown, and we'd eat while he shared stories about his early failures, his biggest mistakes, and the lessons that shaped his philosophy. Wealth whispers, poverty screams, he told me one evening as we watched the sunset from our office window. The most successful people rarely announce their victories. They're too busy creating the next one. It was David who taught me that true success isn't about the money you make or the recognition you receive. It's about the problems you solve and the lives you improve. He'd built his empire not by chasing valuations or media attention, but by quietly creating solutions that actually mattered to real people. When TechFlow was acquired by Google in February 2020 for $300 million, I used my share of the buyout to start my own company. David became my first investor, writing a check for $750,000 based on nothing more than a handshake and a 2-page business plan I'd scribbled on a napkin. Most people thought I was crazy to leave the security of a Google acquisition to start over, but David understood. He saw something in me that reminded him of himself at my age, back when he was just another immigrant kid from Taiwan with big dreams and empty pockets. The watch on my wrist had been with him through all of it. He'd made it himself in 1995, back when he was still tinkering with hardware before he discovered his true calling in software. Only 25 of these prototypes existed, each one handcrafted in his Cambridge garage during the long nights when he was building his first company. Standing there in that church, listening to CEO after CEO praise David's business acumen and strategic brilliance, I realized none of them really knew him the way I did. They saw the successful entrepreneur, the brilliant investor, the tech visionary. But I knew the man who drove a 10-year-old Camry because he believed expensive cars were just ego dressed up as transportation. I knew the mentor who'd rather spend his Saturday helping a struggling founder than attending another industry conference. I knew the teacher who measured his wealth not in dollars, but in the number of people he'd helped along the way. As the service ended and people began filing out, I caught my reflection in one of the church's stained glass windows. There, I was a 29-year-old woman in a simple black dress, wearing a watch worth more than most people's houses, and nobody in that room had any idea what I'd built with David's guidance. In 3 weeks, I'd be sitting at my family's Christmas dinner table, listening to my cousins brag about their latest luxury purchases, while my parents worried about my future. They had no idea that the company I'd been quietly building had just been valued at over $400 million. They couldn't see past my modest apartment and my second-hand clothes to understand that I was living David's philosophy every single day. The watch felt heavier as I walked out into the crisp November afternoon, not because of its monetary value, but because of the responsibility it represented. David had spent his life proving that true wealth whispers. Now it was my turn to carry that lesson forward, even if it meant letting my own family think I was the failure of the Mitchell clan. Little did I know that in just 5 weeks, this watch would change everything. But first, let me take you back to March 2020, when the world was falling apart, and I was crazy enough to think it was the perfect time to start a company. I remember sitting in David's car outside my tiny studio apartment in Tribeca, watching him write out a check for $750,000, like it was grocery money. The ink wasn't even dry on my separation agreement from TechFlow, and here I was about to become an entrepreneur in the middle of a global pandemic. "You sure about this timing, Sarah?" David asked, glancing up at the building where I lived in a space barely bigger than most people's walk-in closets. "The whole world's shutting down and you want to launch a startup." I looked down at that check, more money than I'd ever seen in my life, and felt something I'd never experienced before. Pure, terrifying certainty. That's exactly why it's perfect timing. While everyone else is panicking, we'll be building solutions they don't even know they need yet. David smiled and handed me the check. "That's my girl. Just remember, this money isn't for you to get comfortable. It's for you to get uncomfortable in all the right ways." I named the company Mitch Tech Solutions, using my family name instead of something flashy. David had taught me that the best companies solve problems so well that the brand becomes secondary to the value. Plus, keeping my last name meant my family would never accidentally stumble across us in their casual reading of business publications. Those first 18 months were a blur of 16-hour days, instant ramen dinners, and more caffeine than any human should consume. I was building an AI-powered business optimization platform, something that could help small and medium businesses compete with corporations by using predictive analytics and process automation. Basically, I wanted to give the little guys the same technological advantages that only Fortune 500 companies could afford. My studio apartment became mission control. 600 square feet of controlled chaos with servers humming in the corner, whiteboards covering every wall, and takeout containers stacked like a monument to my complete lack of work-life balance. I coded until my eyes burned, tested algorithms until they broke, then rebuilt them stronger. David would show up every Thursday around 7 p.m. with bags of food from Golden Dragon, this little Chinese place in Chinatown that made the best honey walnut shrimp in the city. He'd clear space on my tiny kitchen counter, and we'd eat while he grilled me about customer discovery, market positioning, and burn rate management. "Sarah," he said. One particularly difficult evening in November 2020, when I was convinced the whole venture was doomed, "You're building something that matters. But if you burn yourself out trying to do everything perfectly, you'll never live to see it succeed." I was exhausted, broke, and starting to question whether I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. We had a prototype that worked beautifully in controlled conditions, but crashed spectacularly when real customers tried to use it. I hadn't taken a real day off in 8 months, and my savings account was approaching zero faster than I cared to admit. But David saw something I couldn't see yet. He helped me understand that every failure was just expensive education, and every setback was teaching me something essential about building a company that could last. The breakthrough came in August 2022, almost 2.5 years after we started. A mid-size manufacturing company in Ohio had been struggling with supply chain optimization and inventory management. Their operations were bleeding money because they couldn't predict demand patterns or automate their procurement processes. I'll never forget the phone call when their CEO told me our platform had reduced their operational costs by 32% in just 3 months. 32%? That wasn't just improvement, that was transformation. Word spread the way good news does in tight business communities. By December 2022, we had 6 Fortune 1000 clients and a wait list of companies wanting pilot programs. I hired my first employees, moved operations to a real office in Lower Manhattan, and started paying myself an actual salary for the first time in nearly 3 years. But here's the thing that would have driven my family crazy if they'd known. Even as the revenue grew and the client list expanded, I kept living like a broke graduate student. Same studio apartment, same subway commute, same Target wardrobe I'd been wearing since business school. People thought I was either incredibly disciplined or completely insane. The truth was simpler than that. David had taught me to reinvest everything back into the company and the people who made it possible. Every dollar we didn't spend on unnecessary luxuries was a dollar we could use to hire better talent, improve our technology, or help more businesses succeed. By October 2024, when we closed our Series C funding round, MitchTech was valued at $420 million. I owned 65% of the company, which meant that, on paper, I was worth about $273 million. $273 million. Let that sink in for a moment. I was worth more than most professional athletes, more than most Hollywood stars, more than some small country's entire GDP, and absolutely nobody in my family had any idea. I still made my lunch every morning and carried it to work in a brown paper bag. I still took the subway instead of calling a car service. I still shopped at Target for clothes and bought generic brand groceries. Not because I had to, but because David had shown me that true wealth isn't about what you can afford to buy. It's about what you choose not to buy, so you can invest in what really matters. The morning of David's funeral, I'd gotten dressed in the same simple black dress I'd worn to my college graduation, paired with practical flats I'd bought on sale 3 years earlier. I looked in the mirror and saw exactly what my family saw when they looked at me. A 29-year-old woman who appeared to be struggling financially, making questionable life choices, and falling behind her more successful cousins. They had no idea I was wearing a $3 million watch, or that the company they thought was a hobby project was actually worth nearly $500 million. As I walked out of Trinity Church that November afternoon, I realized David's greatest lesson was still ahead of me. He'd taught me how to build wealth in silence, but he'd never prepared me for the day I'd have to reveal it. Christmas was 5 weeks away, and I had no idea that this year's family dinner would test everything David had taught me about the difference between having money and understanding wealth. To understand why that Christmas dinner would become such a pivotal moment, you need to know about the Mitchell family dynamics that had been shaping my life since childhood. My father, Bob Mitchell, was 61 years old and the embodiment of the American dream. He'd started as a small-time contractor in the early 1982 swinging hammers and installing drywall to pay his way through night school. By the time I was born, he'd built Mitchell Properties into one of Westchester County's most successful real estate development companies worth just over $200 million. Dad was proud of what he'd accomplished, and rightfully so. He'd earned every dollar through long hours, smart decisions, and the kind of blue-collar work ethic that built this country. But success had changed him in ways I don't think he fully recognized. The man who used to drive a pickup truck to job sites now had a Mercedes S-Class in the garage and memberships to 3 different country clubs. My mother, Patty, came from an entirely different world. The Whitman family had been Westchester County royalty since before the Civil War. Old money, old names, old expectations about how proper people should behave. She'd married my father not because her family approved, but because she genuinely loved his ambition and character. Over the years, though, she'd become increasingly focused on maintaining the social status that came with Dad's success. Our house was a testament to their combined achievements. An 8,500-square-foot Georgian mansion with 15 rooms situated on 12 acres of perfectly manicured grounds. Mom had decorated it like something out of Architectural Digest, complete with original oil paintings, antique Persian rugs, and furniture that cost more than most people's cars. They'd been members of Westchester Country Club since 1995, the year Dad's company went public. I grew up attending charity galas, debutante balls, and the kind of social events where people measured each other's worth by their jewelry and vacation destinations. The pressure to live up to family expectations had been building my entire life, but it intensified after I graduated from Harvard. See, in the Mitchell family ecosystem, success looked very specific. You married well, preferably to someone from a good family with an established career. You worked in a respectable industry like finance, law, or real estate. You produced grandchildren at appropriate intervals. And above all, you maintained the family image. My uncle Rick, Dad's younger brother, embodied this philosophy perfectly. At 59, he was a wealth manager for high-net-worth clients, the kind of guy who could discuss tax strategies and investment portfolios over cocktails at the club. Rick had married well, lived well, and raised his children to follow the same path. His son Derek was the family's golden boy. 34 years old, Derek was a junior partner at Blackstone Partners, one of Manhattan's most prestigious investment firms. He drove a Porsche 911, Turbo, wore a Rolex Daytona that cost more than most people's annual salary, and rented a penthouse on the Upper East Side that screamed success to anyone who visited. Derek represented everything my family considered the ideal young man. Ambitious, well-connected, financially successful, and completely conventional in all the right ways. At family gatherings, Uncle Rick would beam with pride as Derek discussed his latest deals, his bonus projections, and his plans to buy a house in the Hamptons. Then there was my cousin Jennifer, 27 years old, and the poster child for everything my mother thought I should aspire to become. Jennifer had married Marcus, a corporate lawyer at a white shoe firm, right after college. They owned a beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, drove matching BMW SUVs, and were already talking about starting a family. Jennifer had never worked a day in what most people would consider a real job. She'd done some consulting work for nonprofit organizations, more as a social activity than a career, but her primary occupation was being a successful wife. Mom held her up as the perfect example of a young woman who understood her priorities. And then there was me. At 29, I was the family disappointment, unmarried, childless, living in a tiny apartment, and pursuing what everyone assumed was a failing startup. I'd chosen to work in technology, an industry none of them really understood. I dated occasionally, but never anyone serious enough to bring home for the holidays. I wore clothes from Target instead of department stores, drove a car that was older than some of my employees, and showed no signs of settling down into the kind of life my family respected. The subtle comparisons had been going on for years. At every birthday party, holiday gathering, and family celebration, someone would mention Derek's latest promotion, or Jennifer's beautiful home, or some other cousin's engagement announcement. The conversations were never directly critical of me, but the implication was always clear. Everyone else was succeeding according to family standards, and I was falling behind. Mom would ask pointed questions about my dating life, wondering when I was going to meet someone suitable. Dad would make comments about job security and the benefits of working for an established company instead of chasing entrepreneurial dreams. Uncle Rick would offer to introduce me to eligible young men from good families, men who had steady incomes and sensible career trajectories. The thing that hurt most was how they talked about my work. They'd ask about my little computer project with the kind of patronizing interest you'd show a child's hobby. Mom would tell her friends that I was going through a phase experimenting with technology before eventually settling into something more appropriate. They had no idea that my little computer project was revolutionizing how businesses operated. They couldn't see past my modest lifestyle to understand that I'd built something extraordinary. They measured success by external markers like expensive cars, designer clothes, and prestigious job titles, never recognizing that the most valuable things in life often looked unremarkable from the outside. As Thanksgiving came and went and the Christmas season approached, I could feel the annual pressure building. This year felt different, though, more intense. Maybe it was because I'd just turned 29, and everyone was wondering when I'd finally grow up and get serious about my life. Maybe it was because Derek had just bought his third luxury car, and Jennifer had just announced she was pregnant with her first child. Or maybe it was because for the first time in my life, I was sitting on a secret so big it could change everything, and I had no idea how to handle it. Christmas Eve dinner was just 3 weeks away, and I already knew it was going to be a test of every lesson David had ever taught me about the difference between looking successful and actually being successful. The pressure started building the first week of December, just when I thought things couldn't get more complicated. Mom called me 3 times that Tuesday alone, each conversation more stressful than the last. The first call was about the Christmas Eve dinner menu. The second was about whether I was bringing someone special this year. The third call, which came at 9:30 p.m. while I was reviewing contracts in my office, was the one that really got under my skin. "Sarah, honey, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me," she said, without any preamble. "Are you happy with how your life is turning out?" I set down my pen and rubbed my temples. "What do you mean, Mom? I mean, you're 29 years old. Your cousins have established lives, homes, families. Derek just got promoted again, and Jennifer's having a baby. What do you have to show for all these years since Harvard for one have a business, Mom? A successful business." She sighed, and I could practically hear her shaking her head. "Sweetheart, I know you're passionate about your little tech project, but passion doesn't pay the bills. When are you going to get serious about your future little tech project?" If she only knew that my little tech project had just been approached by the Department of Veterans Affairs for the largest contract in our company's history. "I'm serious about my future," I said quietly. "More serious than you realize." "Well, I hope so, because your father and I are worried. We raised you to aim higher than this." After I hung up, I stared at my computer screen for 20 minutes trying to process the conversation. Here I was, 3 days away from potentially signing a $180 million contract with the federal government, and my own mother thought I was wasting my life. The VA contract had been 9 months in the making. Their claims processing system was a disaster, taking an average of 18 months to resolve veteran benefit claims. Our AI platform could reduce that to 6 weeks while improving accuracy by 40%. It wasn't just a business opportunity, it was a chance to help the people who'd served our country get the benefits they'd earned. The negotiations had been intense. Government contracts always are. There were security clearances to obtain, compliance protocols to implement, and enough paperwork to fill a small warehouse. But if we landed this deal, it would establish MitchTech as a major player in the government contracting space and validate everything we'd built. The contract signing was scheduled for December 27th, 3 days after Christmas. I'd been working 18-hour days for weeks preparing presentations, coordinating with our legal team, and managing the technical specifications that would make or break the deal. But that wasn't the only pressure I was dealing with. TechCorp Incorporated, a billion-dollar technology conglomerate based in Silicon Valley, had been sniffing around our business for months. At first, their interest seemed friendly. They'd reached out about potential partnerships, collaboration opportunities, ways we might work together. I'd been polite but non-committal, sensing something predatory beneath their corporate charm. Then my CFO, Rachel, came into my office with disturbing news. TechCorp had hired a corporate intelligence firm to investigate MitchTech's financial backing. They were trying to understand how a small startup could compete so effectively without massive venture capital investment. "Sarah," she said, closing my office door behind her, "they think your family money is propping us up. They're assuming we're some kind of vanity project backed by Daddy's real estate fortune." The irony was almost funny. Here was this massive corporation trying to figure out our secret funding source, never imagining that we'd built everything through pure revenue growth and smart reinvestment. They couldn't conceive of a business that had become valuable without burning through hundreds of millions in investor cash. But their investigation was making everyone nervous. Our employees were getting LinkedIn messages from TechCorp recruiters. Our clients were receiving calls about switching to TechCorp's competing platform. This wasn't just business intelligence gathering, this was the beginning of a hostile takeover attempt. Rachel and I spent hours developing defensive strategies. We reviewed our contracts, strengthened our intellectual property protections, and prepared legal responses to what we expected would be increasingly aggressive tactics. The stress was overwhelming, and for the first time since David died, I really felt his absence. He would have known exactly how to handle TechCorp. He would have had strategies for managing family pressure while closing the VA deal. He would have reminded me that external validation was meaningless compared to the work itself. Instead, I was juggling conference calls with federal procurement officers while my mother left voicemails about my Christmas outfit choices. I was preparing for potential corporate warfare, while my family assumed I was struggling to keep a hobby business afloat. The worst part was the loneliness. I couldn't share my victories with anyone who mattered to me. When we received preliminary approval for the VA contract, I wanted to call my parents and tell them their daughter had just landed the biggest government technology deal of the year. Instead, I sat in my office alone, looking at David's watch and wishing he was there to celebrate with me. My assistant knocked on the door, interrupting my thoughts. "Sarah, your mother's online too. She says it's urgent about Christmas dinner." I picked up the phone, knowing exactly what this conversation would be about. "Sarah, I've been thinking about Saturday night," Mom said. "I really think you should wear that navy blue dress I bought you last year. The one with the nice neckline. And maybe do something different with your hair." "Mom, it's just family dinner. It's Christmas Eve dinner, and it matters how we present ourselves. Jennifer's bringing Marcus, and Derek's bringing that lovely girl he's been seeing. You're the only one showing up alone." I closed my eyes. "I'm focused on other priorities right now." "That's exactly the problem," she said. "You're so focused on that business of yours that you're missing out on what really matters. Life, Sarah. A real life with a future." After we hung up, I realized I had a choice to make. I could keep pretending that my business was just a small project, keep living like I was barely scraping by, keep letting my family think I was the disappointment of the Mitchell clan. Or I could find a way to show them the truth, without betraying everything David had taught me about quiet success. The watch on my wrist caught the light from my desk lamp, and I remembered David's words about wealth, whispering while poverty screams. In 20 days, I'd be sitting at that Christmas dinner table, surrounded by family members who measured success by external appearances. They had no idea that the quiet girl in Target clothes was about to become one of the youngest women ever to secure a 9-figure government contract. The question was whether I was ready to let them find out. That question became more complicated on the 10th of December when Edward Thornton called. Edward had been the Mitchell family lawyer for over 30 years. handling everything from business contracts to estate planning with the kind of old-school discretion that wealthy families valued. When his secretary called to schedule a meeting about Grandfather William's will, I assumed it was just a formality. Grandfather had passed away on the 20th of November, just 5 days after David's funeral. William Mitchell had been 91 years old, sharp as a tack until the very end, and worth approximately $50 million according to the whispered estimates that circulated through family conversations. The meeting was scheduled for the 15th of December, but Derek couldn't wait that long to start planning his windfall. I overheard him talking to Uncle Rick at Jennifer's baby shower the weekend, before their voices carrying across the country club dining room, where the family had gathered to celebrate the upcoming addition to our clan. "I'm thinking Central Park West," Derek was saying, scrolling through real estate listings on his phone. "Something with park views, maybe a duplex." Grandfather always said the family money should be invested in Manhattan real estate. Rick nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking, son." William was always practical about wealth preservation. "I'm sure he structured the inheritance to reward the family members who've proven themselves financially responsible." Derek grinned. 20 years of building my career, making the right connections, showing him I understand how money works. It's finally going to pay off." I sat at the nearby table picking at my salad and trying not to roll my eyes. Derek had been counting Grandfather's money since college, assuming that his prestigious job and expensive lifestyle made him the obvious choice to inherit the family wealth. What Derek didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Grandfather William had been quietly following my career for years. I discovered this by accident when I was helping Mom clean out his study after the funeral. Tucked inside his mahogany desk were folders containing newspaper clippings, magazine articles, and printed internet stories about Mitch Tech Solutions. Articles from the Wall Street Journal about emerging AI companies, a Bloomberg piece about women entrepreneurs changing the tech landscape. Even a TechCrunch article that mentioned our platform's impact on small business efficiency. Every article that mentioned me or my company had been carefully cut out and saved with handwritten notes in Grandfather's precise script. Impressed by her approach, he'd written next to one story. "Building rather than inheriting," he'd noted beside another. The most surprising discovery was a letter he'd apparently started writing, but never finished, dated just 2 weeks before his death. "Dear Sarah," it began, "I've been watching your progress with great admiration. You remind me of myself at your age, when I was determined to build something meaningful rather than simply inherit what others had created. Your approach to business and life shows wisdom beyond your years." The letter ended there unfinished, but it revealed something I'd never suspected. Grandfather had been proud of me even when the rest of the family saw my choices as disappointing. But family inheritance drama wasn't the only legal complication threatening to derail my carefully balanced life. 3 days after Edward Thornton's call, I received a certified letter that made my blood run cold. David's estranged nephew, Tommy Chen, was suing the Chen Foundation for $30 million. Tommy claimed that I had manipulated David during his final months, exploiting his illness to gain control of foundation assets that should have gone to family members. According to the lawsuit, I had unduly influenced David's charitable giving decisions and fraudulently positioned myself as his primary beneficiary. The accusations were absurd and deeply hurtful. David had been mentally sharp until his final week, and every decision about the foundation had been carefully documented by his lawyers. But Tommy's legal team had crafted a compelling narrative about a young gold digger who'd taken advantage of an elderly billionaire's loneliness and declining health. My corporate attorney, Jennifer Walsh, called an emergency meeting to discuss the implications. "Sarah," she said, spreading the legal documents across her conference table, "this lawsuit is clearly frivolous, but it's also potentially dangerous. Tommy's team is hoping to force a settlement rather than go to trial." "How much are they hoping for?" I asked. Jennifer pointed to a paragraph in the filing. $30 million plus control of the foundation's educational initiatives. Basically, they want to gut everything David built and turn it into a family slush fund. The educational programs were David's pride and joy. The foundation provided scholarships, mentorship, and technology access to underprivileged students across the country. It was his way of giving other young people the opportunities he'd fought to create for himself. "What do you recommend?" I asked, though I already knew my answer. "Honestly, settle. Pay them 10 or 15 million and make this go away. A prolonged legal battle could damage your reputation right when your company is gaining momentum. The government contract alone could be worth hundreds of millions over time. Don't risk that for principle." I looked down at David's watch, remembering his stories about the early days when everyone told him to compromise, to take the easy path to avoid fights that might damage his reputation. "No," I said quietly. "We fight this." David built that foundation to help kids who remind him of himself. "I'm not going to let his nephew turn it into a family trust fund." Jennifer sighed. "Sarah, I understand the emotional attachment, but this lawsuit could drag on for years. The legal fees alone will cost millions, and there's always the risk that a jury might find their arguments persuasive." "Then we'd better build an airtight case," I replied. David documented every decision he made about the foundation. "We have meeting notes, email records, medical reports showing his mental competency. We have witnesses who can testify about his genuine commitment to those educational programs." But even as I said the words, I knew Jennifer was right about the risks. A high-profile lawsuit would attract media attention I couldn't afford, especially while TechCorp was looking for weaknesses to exploit. The timing couldn't have been worse, with the VA contract still pending, and my family completely unaware of my business success. As I left Jennifer's office that evening, I realized I was walking a tightrope that kept getting narrower. On one side was the family that thought I was failing at life. On the other side was a business world that was finally recognizing what I'd built. And underneath it all was the growing certainty that my carefully maintained facade was about to crumble in ways I couldn't predict or control. Christmas Eve was still 2 weeks away, but I could already feel the weight of secrets that were becoming too heavy to carry alone. When Christmas Eve finally arrived, I felt like I was preparing for battle rather than a family celebration. I stood in my tiny Tribeca apartment at 4 p.m, staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. Dark jeans, a simple cashmere sweater in navy blue, and David's watch tucked discreetly under my left cuff. The outfit looked exactly like what it was: understated, practical, and completely out of step with my family's expectations for Christmas dinner attire. The Uber ride to Westchester took 45 minutes through holiday traffic, giving me plenty of time to rehearse conversations I hoped to avoid. My phone buzzed twice with work emails about the VA contract, but I forced myself not to check them. Tonight was about family, even if my family had no idea who I really was. The Mitchell estate looked like something out of a holiday movie. Professional decorators had transformed the already impressive Georgian mansion into a winter wonderland complete with thousands of white lights outlining every window and doorframe. The circular driveway was lined with luminarias, and a massive wreath hung on the front door adorned with gold ribbon and real pine boughs. I paid the Uber driver and grabbed my small bag of gifts, all wrapped in simple brown paper and tied with twine. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive looking, just thoughtful presents I'd chosen carefully for each family member. Michael Santos answered the door before I could ring the bell. Michael had been our family's butler and general household manager for over 20 years, a kind man in his mid-60s who somehow managed to be both professional and genuinely warm. "Miss Sarah," he said with a smile, taking my coat. "So good to see you. Your family's in the main drawing room." "Thanks, Michael. How's your grandson doing at Fordham?" Michael's face lit up. "He's doing wonderfully, thank you for asking. Dean's List again this semester. He still talks about the advice you gave him about his computer science classes." I smiled, remembering the conversation I'd had with Michael's grandson about programming fundamentals and career planning. It was moments like these that reminded me why David's philosophy about helping others mattered more than accumulating wealth. The main drawing room was a study in Christmas elegance. A 12-foot Fraser fir dominated one corner, decorated with Waterford crystal ornaments and imported German glass baubles that probably cost more than most people's cars. The fireplace crackled with a perfectly arranged log display, and classical Christmas music played softly from hidden speakers. My family was assembled in their usual formation. Dad stood near the fireplace, scotch in hand, deep in conversation with Uncle Rick. Mom held court on the antique sofa, discussing something animated with Linda, Rick's wife. Derek lounged in a leather chair, and Jennifer sat nearby with her husband Marcus, her hand resting protectively on her barely visible baby bump. "Sarah, darling," Mom called out as I entered the room. "There you are." She stood to give me the obligatory air kiss, and I could see her eyes quickly scanning my outfit with barely concealed disapproval. "Sarah, we discussed appropriate attire for Christmas dinner," she said quietly, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "This is appropriate, Mom. It's just family." Derek looked up from his phone and grinned. "Still shopping secondhand, cousin? That sweater looks familiar. Didn't you wear it to Easter dinner?" I felt heat rise in my cheeks but kept my voice calm. "It's cashmere, Derek. Some things are worth keeping." "Oh, I'm sure it is," he said, standing to show off his wrist. "Speaking of quality, check out my Christmas bonus gift to myself. New Breitling Navitimer, limited edition, $28,000. But when you close a $2.8 million year like I just did, you celebrate appropriately." The watch was flashy and oversized, exactly the kind of statement piece Derek loved. He made sure everyone in the room got a good look at it, turning his wrist to catch the light. Jennifer chimed in from her spot on the couch. "Marcus got me this for Christmas," she said, displaying a tennis bracelet that sparkled with what had to be 5 carats of diamonds. "Cartier. We're celebrating his promotion to partner and the baby news." "Congratulations," I said genuinely. "That's wonderful about the partnership." "Thanks," Marcus replied. "It's been a good year. We're actually looking at houses in the Hamptons now. Jennifer wants something with ocean views for when the baby comes." The conversation continued in this vein for the next hour. Derek dominated with stories about his year-end bonus, his latest client acquisitions, and his plans to buy a weekend house in Martha's Vineyard. Jennifer and Marcus discussed private schools they were considering for their unborn child and vacation homes they were touring. Dad praised Derek's professional achievements, noting how proud Uncle Rick must be to have raised such a successful son. He made pointed comments about the importance of building wealth while you're young and establishing yourself in a respectable career. "And what about you?" Sarah, Dad asked during a lull in the conversation. "Any progress updates on your business venture?" The way he said business venture made it sound like a hobby I'd eventually outgrow. "Things are going well," I replied carefully. "We're expanding our client base and developing new applications for our platform." "That's nice, honey," Mom said in the tone people use when they're humoring a child. "Maybe next year you'll be ready to consider something more stable." Derek laughed. "Uncle Bob, you're being too diplomatic. Sarah's little startup is admirable, but let's be realistic about market conditions. Tech companies are dropping like flies right now. Maybe it's time to consider my offer about an entry-level position at the firm." I felt David's watch against my wrist, hidden beneath the cashmere cuff, and remembered his words about wealth, whispering while poverty screams. Looking around this room filled with people displaying their success like peacocks showing their feathers, I understood exactly what he meant. The irony was almost overwhelming. Here, I sat wearing a $3 million watch and owning a company worth more than everyone else's assets combined, while they pitied me for my modest lifestyle and assumed I was struggling financially. Michael appeared in the doorway to announce dinner, and I stood with the rest of the family knowing that the hardest part of the evening was still ahead of me. As we filed into the formal dining room, I had no idea that this Christmas Eve would be the night everything changed. But before we could sit down for dinner, Derek's phone rang with a call that visibly rattled him. He stepped into the hallway to take it, and I could hear fragments of his conversation through the doorway. "SEC preliminary inquiry," he was saying in a low, tense voice. "No, I understand the seriousness. Yes, we'll cooperate fully." When he returned to the drawing room, Derek's confident demeanor had cracked slightly. His face was pale, and he kept checking his phone obsessively. Uncle Rick noticed immediately. "Everything all right, son?" Rick asked. "Just work stuff," Derek replied, forcing a smile. "You know how it is during year-end." Everyone's trying to wrap up loose ends before the holidays. But I could see the tension in Derek's shoulders, the way he kept touching his expensive watch like a nervous habit. Whatever that phone call had been about, it wasn't routine year-end business. As Michael prepared to escort us to the dining room, Mom caught my arm and pulled me aside into the hallway. "Sarah, I need to address something difficult," she said, her voice low but firm. "You're almost 30 years old, and frankly, you're living like a graduate student. It's becoming embarrassing." I felt my stomach tighten. "Mom, this isn't the time or place for this conversation." "When is the time?" she continued, ignoring my protest. "You show up to family events in clothes that look like they came from a thrift store. You live in a studio apartment that's smaller than some people's closets. You have no serious relationship, no financial security, no plan for your future." I tried to interrupt, but she was just getting started. "Your cousins own homes, have established careers, meaningful relationships. Jennifer's married and starting a family. Derek just had the most successful year of his career. And what do you have to show for yourself? A startup that's clearly struggling and a wardrobe from discount stores." The injustice of it hit me like a physical blow. Here was my mother criticizing my life choices while I was 3 days away from signing the largest government contract in my company's history. I wanted to tell her that my so-called struggling startup was worth more than Dad's entire real estate empire, but David's voice in my head reminded me that true wealth doesn't need to announce itself. "Mom," I said carefully, "I'm building something meaningful, something that matters." "Building what exactly?" she replied. "Sarah, I love you, but this whole humble entrepreneur thing has gone on long enough. You're wasting your potential, and your father and I are tired of making excuses for your choices." That's when Dad appeared beside us, having overheard enough of the conversation to join the attack. "Your mother's right, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the authority he used in business negotiations. "This whole humble entrepreneur act needs to end. We didn't invest in your Harvard education for you to live beneath your potential." I felt blindsided by the coordinated assault from both parents. This wasn't just casual criticism anymore. This was an intervention, a unified family front designed to shame me into conforming to their definition of success. "Dad, I'm not living beneath my potential. I'm living according to my values." "Values don't pay for retirement, Sarah," he replied. "Values don't buy houses or provide security for families. At some point, you need to get serious about your future." Derek chose that moment to approach us, having apparently recovered enough from his mysterious phone call to insert himself into our family drama. "Uncle Bob, Aunt Patty," he said with false concern. I couldn't help but overhear. "Maybe it's time Sarah considers some practical options." He turned to me with a patronizing smile that made my skin crawl. "Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation earlier. My firm has several entry-level positions opening up in the new year. Junior analyst roles, nothing too demanding. I could put in a word with the hiring committee. The starting salary is only around $60,000, but it's steady work with good benefits and real growth potential." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Derek was offering me charity, a pity job at his prestigious firm, assuming I was desperate enough to accept scraps from his successful career. "That's very generous of you, Derek, but I'm not interested in changing careers right now." "Sarah," Mom interjected, "this is exactly the kind of opportunity you should be considering. Derek's being incredibly kind to offer this." I looked around at the three of them, my parents and my cousin, all united in their belief that I needed saving from my own poor decisions. They had no idea that Derek's entry-level salary offer was less than what I paid some of our junior developers. They couldn't see past my modest lifestyle to recognize that I'd built something extraordinary. The emotional foundation I'd carefully maintained for years began to crack under the weight of their coordinated disappointment. These were the people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally, and instead they were treating me like a charity case who needed their intervention to avoid complete failure. "I appreciate everyone's concern," I said quietly, struggling to keep my voice steady. "But I'm exactly where I want to be in my life." Derek laughed, a sound that held no warmth. "Sarah, come on. You're living paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment wearing the same clothes you bought in college. Nobody wants to be where you are." The cruelty of that comment hit harder than anything else they'd said. Derek wasn't just criticizing my choices, he was attacking my worth as a person. And my parents were standing there nodding in agreement, watching their daughter get verbally eviscerated by her cousin without saying a word in my defense. I touched David's watch beneath my sweater cuff, drawing strength from the reminder of what real success looked like. David had faced moments like this throughout his career, times when people underestimated him, dismissed him, assumed he was failing because he didn't fit their narrow definition of achievement. Michael appeared in the hallway, saving me from having to respond to Derek's attack. "Dinner is served," he announced quietly, and I followed my family into the formal dining room, knowing that the worst of the evening was still ahead of me. As I took my seat at the beautifully appointed table, surrounded by crystal and china and the people who claimed to love me, I realized that keeping my success secret had protected me from a lot of things, but it couldn't protect me from this kind of casual cruelty disguised as concern. The real battle was just beginning. The formal dining room was a masterpiece of holiday elegance, with an antique mahogany table that had been in the Mitchell family for 4 generations. Mom had set it with her finest sterling silver service and spode Christmas china, each place setting worth more than most people spent on their entire holiday celebration. Crystal stemware caught the light from the chandelier above, and the centerpiece featured white roses, holly, and gold ribbon, arranged by the same florist who decorated the Westchester Country Club for special events. This was Mom's stage, where she could showcase the family's prosperity and refinement. As we took our seats, the conversation naturally flowed toward the year's achievements and acquisitions. Derek immediately launched into detailed stories about his European business trips, describing 5-star hotels in London and exclusive client dinners in Zurich. The Peterson account alone generated $4.2 million in fees this year, he said, cutting into his perfectly prepared filet mignon. We flew the entire client team to Paris for the closing dinner. Michelin-starred restaurant wine, older than some of our junior analysts. Jennifer beamed as she shared her excitement about house hunting in the Hamptons. "We looked at this incredible place in East Hampton last weekend," she said. 8 bedrooms, pool house, tennis court. The asking price is $4.7 million, but Marcus thinks we can negotiate down to 4.2. The architectural details are stunning, Marcus added. Built in 1928, completely renovated with modern amenities, but maintaining the original character. Jennifer wants something with history for the baby. I sat quietly answering direct questions with minimal responses while internally processing how different my family's values were from everything David had taught me. They measured worth by price tags and prestige, while I'd learned to value impact and authenticity. Derek dominated the conversation with increasingly elaborate stories about his success. He described a recent skiing trip to St. Moritz, a client entertainment event at the Masters tournament, and his plans to buy a second home in Martha's Vineyard. "It's all about building relationships in this business," he explained to the table. "When you're managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions, clients expect a certain lifestyle. They need to know you understand their world." Dad nodded approvingly. "That's smart thinking, Derek. Perception matters in business. People want to work with someone who looks successful." The implicit criticism wasn't lost on me. While Derek was building his image through expensive vacations and luxury purchases, I was apparently failing to project the kind of success that inspired confidence. Mom, perhaps sensing the tension, tried to draw me into the conversation. "Sarah, you've been very quiet tonight. Surely you have some updates about your work to share with the family." The way she phrased it made my business sound like a hobby I might eventually abandon. I could feel all eyes at the table turning toward me, waiting for me to contribute something to their catalog of achievements. "Things are going well," I said simply. "We're growing steadily and developing new applications for our platform." Derek laughed, a sound that contained more condescension than humor. "That's great, cousin. Very admirable that you're sticking with it." Mom's patience finally snapped. Sarah never contributes to these conversations because, frankly, there's nothing exciting to share. We're all talking about real accomplishments, and she sits there like she's attending someone else's dinner. The attack felt like a slap across the face delivered in front of the entire family during Christmas dinner. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but before I could respond, Derek piled on. "Aunt Patty, don't be harsh," he said with fake sympathy. "Sarah's little startup is admirable. Very authentic. Not everyone can handle the pressure of real business success." The word authentic dripped with sarcasm, and I realized Derek was enjoying this public humiliation. He'd been building toward this moment all evening, positioning himself as the family success story, while systematically undermining my credibility. Dad decided to add fuel to the fire. "At least your cousins drive appropriate vehicles and live in suitable accommodations. Sarah arrived tonight like she's summoning a taxi service. It's embarrassing, honestly." The coordinated attack intensified as my family ganged up on me during what was supposed to be a celebration of love and togetherness. Uncle Rick joined in with comments about financial responsibility. Linda mentioned how important it was for young women to think about their futures. Even Marcus, who barely knew me, felt comfortable making observations about career stability. I felt completely isolated, surrounded by people who claimed to love me but were systematically destroying my character because I didn't fit their narrow definition of success. The hurt went deeper than I'd expected, cutting through years of emotional armor I'd built to protect myself from their judgment. The irony was overwhelming. Here I sat 3 days away from signing a federal contract worth more than Derek's entire career earnings, while my family pitied me for my apparent failures. I was wearing a watch worth more than some houses, surrounded by people who assumed I couldn't afford decent jewelry. I excused myself quietly, claiming I needed to use the powder room. Nobody seemed surprised by my departure, probably assuming I was retreating in shame from their collective wisdom about my life choices. In the guest bathroom, I locked the door and leaned against the marble vanity, looking at my reflection in the mirror. My face was flushed, my eyes bright with unshed tears, and I looked every bit like the struggling young woman they believed me to be. I pulled back my sweater cuff and looked at David's watch, remembering his words about character revealing itself under pressure. This was my test, he would have said. This was the moment that would define who I really was. David had faced moments like this throughout his career. Times when people underestimated him, dismissed his ideas, assumed he was failing, because he didn't conform to their expectations. He'd learned that the opinion of others was just noise, background static that could distract you from building something meaningful. I took 3 deep breaths, straightened my shoulders, and prepared to return to the table. I wouldn't defend myself or argue with their assessments. I would simply endure the rest of dinner with the dignity David had taught me, knowing that true wealth had nothing to do with their approval. But as I opened the bathroom door and headed back toward the dining room, I had no idea that the evening was about to take a turn that would change everything. When I returned to the table, I forced myself to maintain the composed demeanor I'd practiced in the mirror. The conversation had moved on to investment strategies, with Uncle Rick explaining portfolio diversification to Marcus, while Derek nodded along like the expert he believed himself to be. I slipped back into my seat, quietly hoping to finish dinner without further incident. But Derek, apparently emboldened by the family's earlier support of his attacks on my character, wasn't finished with me yet. "You know, Uncle Bob," he said with a grin that made my stomach clench. "Remember when you offered Sarah a position after Harvard talk about dodging a bullet there?" Dad looked up from his wine glass, curious where this was heading. Derek continued, his voice gaining confidence. "I mean, imagine having someone who takes public transportation representing Mitchell Properties to high-end clients. Can you picture Sarah showing up to a multi-million-dollar real estate closing in an Uber?" The room erupted in cruel laughter. Uncle Rick nearly choked on his scotch. Jennifer giggled behind her hand. Even Linda, who'd been relatively quiet all evening, smiled at the image Derek had painted. I felt the familiar sting of their mockery, but this time, something inside me had shifted during those few minutes alone in the bathroom. David's teachings about dignity under pressure had taken root, and I found myself strangely calm in the face of their cruelty. I reached for my water glass with steady hands, taking a small sip while Derek basked in the appreciation of his audience. The movement caused my sweater cuff to slide back slightly, exposing just a glimpse of David's watch. It was such a small thing, barely visible for more than a second. But Dad's eyes happened to be looking in my direction when it happened, and I watched his expression change in real time. His casual smile faded, his eyes focused intently on my wrist. The fork in his hand seemed to freeze halfway to his mouth. "Sarah," he said, his voice suddenly quiet. "What is that on your wrist?" The laughter around the table died instantly. Everyone turned to look at me, then at Dad, trying to understand what had caused such a dramatic shift in his demeanor. I glanced down at my wrist where David's watch had slipped back under my cuff. It's just a watch David gave me before he passed away." Derek, still riding high on his moment of family approval, scoffed dismissively. "Probably some sentimental piece from her mentor's garage sale. You know how these startup guys are, Uncle Bob. All image, no substance." But Dad wasn't listening to Derek anymore. He set down his fork carefully, the small clink of silver against china, unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "No," he said firmly, his voice carrying an authority that made Derek's smirk falter. "Derek, be quiet." Dad stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Sarah, may I see that watch?" The intensity in his voice made everyone at the table sit up straighter. Mom looked confused, Uncle Rick frowned, and Derek's confident expression began to crack. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed back my sweater cuff to reveal David's watch fully. The intricate craftsmanship caught the light from the chandelier, and I heard someone draw in a sharp breath. Dad moved around the table toward me, his eyes never leaving my wrist. When he reached my chair, he leaned down to examine the watch more closely, and I watched the color drain from his face. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice shaking now. "That's not just any watch." The room was completely silent, except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Everyone was staring at Dad, who looked like he'd seen a ghost. "This is a David Chen original," he said, his voice growing stronger with recognition. "First-generation prototype. I saw one at a Silicon Valley conference 3 years ago." Derek's scoff died in his throat. "What do you mean original, Dad?" Straightened up his eyes, moving from the watch to my face, with an expression I'd never seen before. "Sarah, there were only 25 of these ever made. David Chen crafted them himself in the 1,990 seconds before he became famous for his software companies." The silence stretched on thick with tension and confusion. I could see Derek's mind working, trying to process this information and fit it into his worldview where I was the family failure. Dad's hands were trembling slightly as he spoke again. "The collector at that conference told me his piece was worth over $3 million. He said Chen only gave them to people who mattered to him personally. $3 million. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. I heard Mom gasp. Uncle Rick's scotch glass slipped in his hand. Jennifer's mouth fell open. Derek was staring at my wrist, like it might contain the secrets of the universe. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. "How, Dad?" asked quietly. "How did David Chen come to give you something so valuable?" I looked around the table at my family's shocked faces, realizing that this was the moment David had prepared me for without either of us knowing it. This was when everything would change, when the careful facade I'd maintained for years would finally crumble. The watch felt warm against my skin as I prepared to answer the question that would reshape everything they thought they knew about me. Dad leaned closer, his hands still trembling, as he examined the intricate details of David's watch. The custom movement was visible through the transparent case back, and I could see him noting the hand-engraved elements that marked it as genuine. "This is absolutely authentic," he said, his voice filled with awe. "Look at the custom movement, the hand-engraved case, even Chen's signature microscopic marking right here on the inner rim." He pointed to a spot so small, I'd never noticed it myself, but his trained eye had found it immediately. Dad had always been fascinated by fine craftsmanship, whether in real estate construction or luxury items. "Sarah," he said, straightening up and looking directly into my eyes, "these timepieces are worth over $3 million. How did David Chen come to give you something so valuable?" The question hung in the air while my family stared at me with expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief. I felt strangely calm, as if this moment had been inevitable all along. David was my mentor and first investor. When I started my company, I said simply. Mom's confusion was written all over her face. Investor? In what exactly? Sarah. Derek's nervous laugh cut through the tension. Your little startup. Come on, Sarah, we're talking about David Chen here. The David Chen. He wouldn't waste time on some college project. I measured my words carefully, knowing that what I was about to say would change everything. Mitch Tech Solutions. We develop AI-powered business optimization platforms for companies that want to compete more effectively in their markets. Derek's laugh grew more strained. Sarah, even if that's true, Chen was worth billions. He didn't invest in tiny startups run by one person out of studio apartments. My voice remained steady as I delivered the information that would shatter their assumptions. We completed our Series C funding round in October. The company valuation reached $420 million. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Derek's face had gone pale, and Mom looked like she was trying to solve a math problem that wouldn't add up. Dad's eyes widened as he processed the number. $420 million, I nodded. I maintain 65% ownership, which means my stake is worth approximately $273 million on paper. Uncle Rick set down his scotch glass with shaking hands. $273 million. The numbers seemed to echo around the dining room, bouncing off the crystal and china like physical objects. Jennifer's mouth was open, Marcus looked stunned, and Linda appeared to be having trouble breathing. But I wasn't finished. We're also finalizing a federal contract worth $180 million over 3 years with the Department of Veterans Affairs. If everything goes as planned, we'll sign on December 27th. Derek's confident demeanor had completely crumbled. He was staring at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language, trying to reconcile the information with everything he thought he knew about my life. That's impossible, he whispered. If you had that kind of money, you wouldn't be living in a studio apartment and taking public transportation. I looked around the table at my family's shocked faces, remembering David's lessons about the difference between having wealth and displaying it. David taught me that true success doesn't require an audience, I said quietly. The most successful people rarely announce their victories because they're too busy creating the next one. Mom was shaking her head slowly. But Sarah, if this is all true, why have you been living like you're struggling financially? Because I'm not struggling, I replied. I live modestly by choice, not necessity. David showed me that expensive cars and designer clothes don't make you successful. They just make you look like you need other people to know you're successful. The irony of the evening hit me fully as I looked around the table. Here, they'd all been spending hours discussing their achievements and acquisitions, their luxury purchases and status symbols, while assuming I had nothing to contribute because I didn't play their game of competitive display. Dad was studying my face intently, and I could see him reevaluating every conversation we'd had about my career, every time he'd worried about my financial security, every moment he'd wished I would choose a more conventional path. The federal contract, he said slowly. With Veterans Affairs. That's the modernization project I read about in the Wall Street Journal. You read about it, Sarah? He said. His voice filled with something that might have been pride. That's one of the largest technology contracts the government has awarded this year. If your company landed that deal, you're not just successful. You're revolutionizing how federal agencies operate. The weight of years of hidden achievements settled over the dining room like a thick blanket. All those times they'd worried about my future, pitied my choices, offered me charity jobs, and financial advice, I'd been quietly building something extraordinary. Derek finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. So when I offered you that entry-level position at my firm for $60,000, you were already worth hundreds of millions. I looked at my cousin, remembering his condescending tone just hours earlier, his assumption that I needed his charity to survive. Derek, I said gently, I pay some of our junior developers more than your firm was offering me. The revelation hung in the air. as my family began to process not just the financial numbers, but the complete reversal of everything they'd believed about my place in the family hierarchy. And in that moment of stunned silence, I realized that the hardest part wasn't over yet. Derek sat in stunned silence for several long moments, his earlier bravado completely shattered. I could see him struggling to process not just the financial numbers I'd revealed, but the complete inversion of our family roles that had just occurred. Finally, he found his voice, though it came out strained and defensive. Even if that's all true, Sarah, real success requires more than just money. It requires recognition, respect, building lasting institutions that people acknowledge and admire. It was a desperate attempt to maintain some superiority to argue that my quiet approach to wealth somehow made it less legitimate than his flashy displays of status. But before I could respond, Derek's phone buzzed with an urgent text message. He glanced down at the screen, and I watched his face drain of all remaining color. His hands started shaking as he read whatever message had just arrived. Uncle Rick noticed immediately. "Son, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Derek's voice cracked when he tried to speak. "The SEC investigation," he whispered. "It's been escalated." "What investigation?" Dad demanded his attention, shifting from my revelation to Derek's obvious distress. Derek could barely get the words out. "Federal prosecutors are getting involved. The trading violations, they've been looking into the pattern recognition software we used to predict market movements, the client information sharing between departments." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence carried a different weight. This wasn't the shocked awe that had greeted my business success. This was the heavy quiet that follows devastating news. Bob leaned forward in his chair. "Derek, what exactly are you telling us?" Derek's voice was barely audible. "Securities fraud charges, insider trading, wire fraud. They're saying there's going to be arrests, Uncle Bob. Federal arrests." The timing was so perfect it almost seemed scripted. Here was Derek, who had spent the entire evening mocking my modest lifestyle and assuming my business was failing, receiving word that his own prestigious career was about to end in federal prosecution. Uncle Rick's Scotch glass slipped from his hand, hitting the table with a sharp crack. "Arrest, Derek. What have you done?" "I didn't do anything wrong," Derek protested weakly. "Everyone in the industry uses predictive algorithms. Everyone shares market intelligence. It's standard practice." But his protest sounded hollow, even to him. I could see in his eyes that he knew exactly what he'd done, and he knew it was illegal. The golden boy of the Mitchell family, the cousin who had everything figured out, the successful investment banker with the expensive watch, and the Porsche, was about to become a federal defendant. I looked around the table at my family's shocked faces. Mom was pressing her hand to her chest. Dad looked stunned, and Jennifer was whispering urgently to Marcus about what this might mean for the family's reputation. In that moment, I had a choice. I could sit back and watch Derek face this crisis alone, letting karma run its course after years of his condescension and cruelty. I could enjoy the poetic justice of his downfall, coinciding with the revelation of my success. But that wasn't what David had taught me about character. "Derek," I said quietly, drawing his attention away from his phone. "I'm sorry you're facing this. Legal troubles can be overwhelming, especially federal cases." He stared at me, confusion mixing with his panic. "Why are you being nice to me after everything I said tonight, after how I've treated you all these years?" "Because that's what family does," I replied. "We support each other during difficult times, even when we haven't always been supportive ourselves." The room was watching our exchange with fascination. Here was the family failure as they'd seen me just minutes ago, offering comfort to the family success story, whose world was crumbling in real time. "If you need help with legal representation costs," I continued, "I'm happy to contribute. Federal defense attorneys are expensive, but a good legal team can make all the difference in cases like this." Derek's eyes filled with tears, and I realized he was finally understanding the complete reversal of our positions. Just hours ago, he'd been offering me charity in the form of an entry-level job. Now, I was offering him financial assistance for his legal defense. Uncle Rick was staring at his son with a mixture of love and disappointment. 20 years of building his reputation, 20 years of being the family's pride and joy, and it was all about to disappear in a federal courtroom. Mom and Dad were still processing both revelations, trying to reconcile their successful daughter with their suddenly criminal nephew. The family dynamics that had seemed so stable just hours ago were shifting like tectonic plates. Jennifer reached across the table to squeeze Derek's hand. "We'll get through this as a family," she said, though. Her voice wavered with uncertainty. I touched David's watch beneath my sweater cuff, remembering his stories about maintaining dignity during both triumph and crisis. This was the test he'd been preparing me for without either of us realizing it. Not just handling success quietly, but responding to others' failures with grace. The Christmas Eve that had started with my family attacking my character was ending with me offering to help the very person who had led that attack. And somehow, in that moment of unexpected compassion, I felt more successful than any business valuation could ever make me feel. The hardest lessons, David used to say, often come disguised as our greatest challenges. Tonight, my family was learning that lesson in ways none of us could have imagined. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, and for the first time in years, I woke up looking forward to seeing my family. The events of Christmas Eve had left everyone emotionally drained, but there was something different in the air when I arrived at the house around 10 a.m. The tension that usually characterized our family gatherings had been replaced by something I'd never experienced before: genuine authenticity. Mom met me at the door, and instead of her usual critical once-over of my outfit, she pulled me into a tight embrace that lasted nearly a full minute. "Sweetheart," she said when she finally let me go, "I owe you the deepest apology. Your father and I have been terrible parents, judging you by all the wrong measures." Her eyes were red-rimmed, and I could tell she'd been crying. The perfect composure she usually maintained during family events was gone, replaced by raw honesty that I'd never seen from her before. Dad appeared beside her, looking older than I remembered, but somehow more genuine. "Sarah, I spent my entire career building something meaningful from nothing, and I should have recognized you were doing the same thing. Instead, I let appearances cloud my judgment." We sat in the living room where yesterday's Christmas tree now seemed less like a display of wealth and more like a symbol of family traditions. The conversation that followed revealed something that stunned me more than any business success ever could. "Your mentor, David Chen, Dad," said quietly, "saved our company 29 years ago." I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" In 1995, Mitchell Properties was facing bankruptcy. We'd overextended on a development project, interest rates spiked, and our financing fell through. We were 3 days away from losing everything when an anonymous investor provided bridge financing that kept us afloat. Mom nodded, taking up the story. "We never knew who it was. The transaction went through a law firm in Boston, and they wouldn't reveal the investor's identity. That money saved our business and our family's future." Dad's voice was thick with emotion. "I found out yesterday after you left. I called my old attorney, and after all these years, he finally told me the truth. The anonymous investor was David Chen." The poetic justice of it hit me like a physical force. David had quietly saved my family's business nearly 3 decades ago, never seeking recognition or gratitude. Years later, he'd mentored their daughter, teaching her the same philosophy of quiet generosity that had once rescued them from financial ruin. Derek appeared in the doorway, looking haggard but somehow more human than I'd ever seen him. He'd aged 10 years overnight, but there was something in his expression that suggested the beginning of wisdom. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I've been arrogant my entire life. I don't deserve your help, but if your offer last night was genuine, I could really use that support." I stood up and walked over to him. "Family supports family, Derek. That's what David taught me about real wealth. It's not about what you can buy for yourself, it's about what you can do for others." Over the next few hours, as we sat around the kitchen table drinking coffee and talking like we never had before, I made an announcement that felt like the natural conclusion to everything David had taught me. "I'm establishing the Chen Mitchell Foundation," I said. "It'll combine our family's legacy with David's educational philosophy. The goal is to provide technology education, mentorship, and opportunities to students who remind us of David and grandfather William, young people who understand that building something meaningful matters more than inheriting something valuable. Dad's eyes lit up with genuine pride. Sarah, I'd like to contribute significantly to that foundation. Your mother and I want to be part of what you're building. The transformation in my family was remarkable to witness. Derek began his legal defense process with the full support of everyone around the table, but more importantly, he started examining his values and priorities in ways he'd never done before. The foundation gave him something to focus on beyond his legal troubles, a chance to rebuild his character while fighting for his freedom. Over the following days, as word of my success spread through Westchester's social circles, Mom found herself in the unusual position of being envied rather than pitied. Her daughter wasn't the family disappointment after all, but the family's greatest success story. 2 days after Christmas, I drove to the Bronx to visit Emma Thompson, a 16-year-old student in our foundation's mentorship program. Emma reminded me of myself at her age, brilliant and ambitious, but lacking the resources and connections that most successful people take for granted. As I watched her work on a coding project that could revolutionize how local food banks distribute resources, I thought about David's watch on my wrist and the responsibility it represented. This was how wealth should whisper through the opportunities we create for others, through the problems we solve quietly and without fanfare. On the 27th of December, Edward Thornton called the family together for the reading of Grandfather William's will. The document contained surprises that would have shocked us a week earlier, but now felt like the natural completion of a cycle that had been decades in the making. The majority of Grandfather's $50 million estate went to me, along with a personal note written in his careful handwriting to my granddaughter, who understands that true wealth builds others up rather than displaying itself. Use this wisely, as I know you will. Derek received a smaller but still substantial inheritance, along with Grandfather's note to Derek, who I hope will learn from his mistakes and discover that real success comes from character, not recognition. As I sit here now, 6 months later, watching our foundation students graduate from their first technology program, I think about that Christmas Eve dinner and how completely it changed my family's understanding of success. David's watch still sits on my wrist, but it no longer feels like a secret I'm keeping. It feels like a promise I'm honored to fulfill. If you've ever been underestimated by your family or felt like the outsider at your own dinner table, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Sometimes the people who seem to be falling behind are actually building something extraordinary that others can't see yet. Share this video if you know someone who needs to hear that real wealth whispers while fake wealth screams, and subscribe for more stories about the quiet victories that matter most. Because in the end, the most successful people aren't the ones making the most noise. They're the ones making the most difference.